Alright, over the next couple videos, we're going to talk about one of the most fundamental aspects of working inside Photoshop, and that is through generating selections. Now, selections inside Photoshop are basically a way of isolating an area of your image so you can work or make changes or effects to that specific area. So when you have an open document in Photoshop, as you're looking at right here, basically all the pixels are active. Everything's fair game to make changes to. So if I grabbed my brush tool, for instance, and just started painting in here, notice it's affecting the entire document. No matter where I paint, something is happening. By generating a selection, you're isolating your changes to a specific area. And the selection tools are located right here in the toolbar. We're going to start up here up top with the shape tools. As you can see, we have the rectangular marquee tool. And if I just go in here to my document and just drag out, you'll notice that I can drag out a square or a rectangular just by freely dragging out this object. And when I release my mouse, it turns into what's known as the marching ants selection area. And what this allows me to do is work specifically in this area without affecting anything else in my image. So if I were to grab that paintbrush tool I was just using and clicked inside here and started painting, it will do the same thing, but when I go outside that area, you notice nothing happens. So it is isolating my changes only to the area I have selected. Now the other shape tool located inside there is of course the elliptical marquee tool. This allows us to generate rounded shape selections. And just by freely dragging, you can notice I get oval shapes, I can go into a more rounded shape. But if you want to constrain your selections to a very specific or a very perfect circle or a perfect square, you would simply add the shift key as you're drawing the selection. I'm going to hold down my shift key and just drag out this box, and you'll notice it gives me a perfect circle. Now once you've created a selection, if you take your cursor and move inside the selected area, you'll notice that it turns into a selection move tool, which if I click and drag, it'll allow me to reposition a selection over any specific area of the image. Now, when you're also using the shape tools to create selections, if you want to add to that area of the selection, or just even add another selected area in addition to the already existing selected area, you would simply add the shift key as well. So if I hold down my shift key and drag from inside this selected area into the outer area, you'll see that it does in fact add it to that selection. And just the same, if I go over here, let's take that square marquee tool and I'll position this right over here. If I want to add another square selection over here on the other side of the document, simply hold down that shift key and then drag out that box accordingly. So now we have two selected areas all within the same image. So if I take that brush tool, again, painting in the area that's not selected, nothing happens. But if I go into those selected areas at the same time, it will paint inside there. So, quick and easy way of using those tools to generate selections. Now another way, where when you want to deselect an area of the image, you notice that they just went away. The way you do that, let's go back in here and let's just draw out another square selection here. So there's my selected area. Now, one way of deselecting that area is simply dragging outside the selected area and going ahead and clicking once, and you'll notice that the selection goes away. Now, another way of doing that, of course, is if you've got a selected area, you can go under the Select menu, and here's where you will go in and make any kind of modifications or changes to your existing selections. But in this case, we want to look for this item right here, which is the Deselect. And you can also use the keyboard shortcut, Command or Control D on your keyboard. But by selecting that item, it does the same thing. It deselects that area and allows me to continue to move on. Now going back into modifying the selections, what I want to do is, let's say for instance on this image, I want to select the rim of this car, that rounded area there. Well, if I go in here and grab that elliptical marquee tool and drag my box out, it doesn't get that area just perfectly. I can probably get close to the size, but it's not selecting that area like I want it to. Well, I need to make some changes to it. So let's go under that Select menu, and I'm going to go down here and grab the Transform selection. And it will give me these free transform frame here, which allows me to modify it. I can change the size up and down, left to right, or I can grab any of the corner handles and modify the shape overall. But I can also rotate the selection. You notice if I drag outside here, I get the little bent arrow, so now I can rotate that selection just a little bit and then reposition it to get it a little bit more accurate into that specific area. I can drag this out, rotate it a little bit more, maybe squeeze that area in a little bit. And once I press enter, my selection is still active, but now it is more isolated to that specific area of the image, meaning I can make whatever changes I want to now. I can make corrections, I can even isolate this selection to its own layer, whatever I need to do. Now, those are the basic shape tools. Now, another selection tool is right beneath here, and these are known as the lasso tools. And I'm just going to go into a blank document here just to demonstrate these. The lasso tools allow you to basically freely draw, or basically freehand draw your selections. The basic lasso tool, of course, if you just take this and I just drag inside my document and just draw a shape, when I get to the end, no matter where I'm at, it's going to automatically close out that selection. So there is my currently active selection. So it allows you to draw around very odd shapes or abstract shapes just in a freehand style, or even just for certain effects you want to achieve, you can just freehand draw that. The next tool under that is known as the polygonal lasso tool. And this, what it does is allows you to basically freehand draw, but it also gives you straight edges on your selections. I'm going to jump over to another document here, and let's say I wanted to select this stop sign and isolate it. Well, I would go ahead and probably use this polygonal lasso tool, and it will allow me to click. Now once I click and drag off to an area, you can see that it's given me this straight line here. And I can just move to the next position I want it to be, and I'll click again. And we'll just go around to each corner of this sign, and you'll notice that it's leaving that those lines in there. And once I get to the end, where my starting point is, you'll see the cursor change into a little circle there. And that's telling me that I'm about to close out the selection. It's going to become active. So once I click, you'll see now that selection is currently active, and I can make any kind of changes I want to do inside of here. Now, let's say, for instance, that I've selected this area, but I've selected, right now, the stop sign itself is the active selection. Let's say I wanted to invert that selection. I want the outer area to be selected and not necessarily the sign itself. Well, it's simply a matter of going under the Select menu and choosing this item here, Inverse Selection. And now you can see that the marching ants are around the edge here, and it's also around the stop sign. But if I grabbed my brush tool like I did a moment ago, and paint it inside the sign, notice nothing happens until I come outside of that area. And now it's painting right outside that area there. Now the only other lasso tool, it's one of the least commonly used ones, but it does work, is the magnetic lasso tool. Now, based on these settings up here, you can draw around a shape, and depending on the contrast between your object and the background, it will generate your selection based on that. So it's a quick and easy way of just drawing a selection when you have a high contrast subject against a background. And you'll notice it does the very same thing. Now, it doesn't work as perfectly on all images. You will want to be careful depending on what type of images you're creating, but that is basically how those general selection tools work. Now, in the next video, we're going to cover some of a newer tool that was introduced back in Photoshop CS3, and we're going to talk about some of the tolerance setting tools like the Magic Wand. Now I want to talk about a couple more selection tools located inside Photoshop, and this first one is known as the Magic Wand tool. And it's not a widely used tool, but it does have its uses, but by understanding how it works, you'll understand when it's good to use it. And basically the way the Magic Wand tool works is, first of all, it's located right beneath those lasso tools. It's right in here. It looks like a little magic wand. And the way it works is it generates a selection based on a color range. And that's known as a tolerance setting. You'll notice up in here we've got our tolerance setting. Now, the default tolerance setting is 32. So when you first select this tool for the very first time, the tolerance is probably going to be set at 32. Now, when you go into a document with this default setting and click in there, so let's say I want to select this red area of this umbrella. With that default setting, if I go ahead and click inside here, you'll notice that it's going to look, initially where I clicked, is going to affect how the rest of the selection is going to work. So if I click in this dark rich area here, based on a range of 32 levels of gray in your image is comprised of 256 levels of gray because it's an 8-bit image. Based on that tolerance setting, it's going to look at the whole image and see what other shades of red fall into that range, and it's going to add it to that selection. You'll notice some areas didn't get selected because they fell outside the range of that. Now you'll notice that this red area and this red area aren't connected, even though it still added it to the selection. And that's because of this setting here. Right now you see this contiguous setting is unchecked, meaning no matter what red area I click, it's going to look at the entire image and add that area to the selection. However, by checking it on and then doing that same thing, if I click right in here, it is only going to select those pixels that are neighboring each other, that are touching. So this area here, this red part of the umbrella, isn't connected to this other red part of the umbrella. Therefore, with this contiguous checked on, it will only select that area. But again, by unchecking it and then reapplying the selection, you'll notice that it does in fact include all that area. Now going back to the tolerance setting, you notice, remember I said it was set at 32. If I increase it, let's say I go to 75 for instance, and I click in that same red area, you'll notice that it has selected pretty much all of those red areas. And those areas that in here that weren't selected before because the tolerance setting was very low, they are now included in that. So when you're using the magic wand and you notice certain areas didn't get selected, you can certainly increase the tolerance and reapply that setting, and it will increase that. Now, another aspect of that, let's go back to the default setting here of 32. Now, let's say I go into this the blue area, for instance, and I use that default setting and click right in there with the magic wand. Notice how it did not select other areas. Again, they're falling out of that tolerance range. Now, if I didn't want to go back in there and just simply modify the tolerance setting, you can go back into that area and hold down your Shift key, and just like we did with that other selecting area with the adding shape selections by holding down the Shift key, you can do the same with the magic wand by holding down the Shift key and then clicking in a new area of the document, and you'll see that it basically is expanding the range of that selection automatically. You haven't changed the tolerance, you're just simply adding to that selection by holding down the Shift key. And it doesn't have to be the additional that same color. You can include additional colors too, so maybe I want to include the red areas in here to that selection. So, gives you an idea of how the magic wand works. Now I want to jump over and talk about another tool that makes a selection based on a color range, and that's the new Quick Selection tool, which is grouped right inside here with the magic wand tool. If I select that, I'm going to jump over to this image here that I've got open. Where'd my little flower go? Here we go. So here I've got an image. It's just a color flower against a green background. And now I want to isolate my selection. I want to select just the flower area itself. Now if I were to use for perhaps the magic wand tool, for instance, and I click, you notice based on that range of colors, it didn't get all the areas I needed. The way the Quick Selection tool works is very similar. Works just like the magic wand in the sense that it paints those tolerance areas as you move your cursor around. So if I click inside here and I just click and start dragging, you notice as I creep outside the selected area and add more color ranges to the selection, it increases that area of the selection. So if I just kind of paint around and add all these areas to my selection, it will generate a selection of the entire flower. Quickly and easily adding to my selection. So if I wanted to, in fact, remove an area, let's say I dragged too far and I added maybe a little bit of this leaf in there. Well, I would simply hold down the Option or Alt key, and you see the plus sign turns into a minus sign. And that just simply is a matter of just clicking right inside there, and it does the exact opposite. It will actually remove that range of colors in there. And I have to be honest, this tool works surprisingly well. It's very popular amongst a lot of users, and being able to generate really accurate selections on relatively complex objects. Now, the contrast between this flower and the background is very obvious, so it made it a little easier to use that tool, but much, much easier when you're doing that. Now, another aspect of that I didn't mention in the last lesson and just briefly touched on a moment ago is removing areas of selection. Now, I talked about holding down the Shift key to add to a selection. But what about removing areas? No matter what type of selection you've got, maybe no matter how it was generated by which tool, all selections are the same, which means you can do all sorts of things to them. So if I generated this selection with the Refine Edge or with the Quick Selection tool, maybe I want to add a square area to it. So if I just hold down my Shift key and just drag inside here, it does the exact same thing. However, if I want to remove part of a selection, you simply hold down the Option key or Alt key, just like I talked about. So I'll just drag inside that area, and it removes that area. So anytime you have an active selection, holding down the Shift key and will add to the selection, holding down the Option or Alt key will remove areas of your selection. Now, one last thing I want to talk about when it comes to selections is once you've generated a selection and you want to make some changes to that, as I mentioned, you can go into the Select menu and you've got various tools here. But one of the cool features about selections is this little button right here. Anytime you're in any selection tool, you'll see this little button that says Refine Edge. When I click on that, it will open up a dialog that will allow me to modify my selection. As far as the radius of the selection goes, if I go and increase this, you'll see the radius of the selection is decreased or increased based on the currently active selection. I can increase the contrast to make those edges a lot sharper. if I want. I can smooth out the selection. If I've generated a selection on an object that has a lot of jagged edges, I can certainly increase the smoothness here. And every setting here, as I drag my mouse over, it shows an example of what's happening for each one. By feathering the selection, I can certainly make those edges considerably softer, as you can see right there. I can contract and expand the selection based on the currently active one. And not only that, I can display how I'm looking at my selection. Here I can see the currently the selection the way it is. Here I can see it in quick mask mode, which gives me a color overlay, basically giving me a visual cue of my selection. Here I can view it against black, against white, or just simply as a straight black and white in case I want to make changes. If I want to tighten that up and take the smoothing down, take the contrast up, I can see the exact changes that are happening there. So it gives you a greater degree of control over how you can change the different aspects of your selection by using those Refine Edge. And as I mentioned, it's available in any selection mode. So quick and easy way of generating selections. I encourage you to just go through each one of the tools and practice on various images and see what kind of results you get, just so you can get used to the tools. And just by getting in the habits of how each tool works, you will become that much better at it. Well, if you were going to ask someone who's been using Photoshop for some time what one of the most important features is, more than likely they're going to answer layers. Layers is definitely the backbone of a lot of images or any kind of workflow inside Photoshop. In fact, the subject of layers is so complex that a full book has been written on it by my colleague, Matt Kloskowski. You can check that out. He also has a couple of courses specifically catered to layers. And true, it is a very, very complex subject, and we're not going to be able to cover all aspects of layers here in this course, but I just want to cover some of the basics so you get a general idea of how layers work. So we're going to cover that over the next few videos. So layers are basically handled in the Layers panel. As you can see by default, it's gone ahead and showed up inside my document here. I'm just going to drag it out so we can talk about this for a little bit. The Layers panel is where all your files are, or all your layers are managed. And here's where you can apply all various kinds of effects right inside the Layers panel as well. Now notice when you have a document open inside Photoshop, you have the background layer. And the background layer is by default locked, meaning it cannot support any transparency. To unlock a background layer, you simply double click it right on the icon and you will get this window that says you can name the layer. And it's basically going to turn it into a normal transparent layer. Now I say transparent because if you go in here and erase, in fact, let me undo that. Let's go back to the locked layer. If I were to take my erase tool and just start erasing on this document, it's not really erasing, it's actually filling it with my background color swatch here in my toolbar. In fact, just to give you a better idea, if I flip this around and make black my background swatch and do the same erasing, it does that very thing. However, if we were to unlock the layer, like I said, if I double click on it and click OK, and use that same eraser tool, and I start erasing, you'll see the transparent background of my document. If you remember back in the preferences, this is where you can modify the transparency settings. Right now it's just a checkered gray background. But that is how you unlock the background layer. Now, you generate new layers in several ways. You can generate a new layer by perhaps generating a selection. Like, so let's say I wanted to isolate this box to its own layer without the white background. Well, one quick and easy way I like to do it, especially if the object is against a white background like this, is I'll go and grab that Magic Wand tool and just simply click the background, and you can notice it selects that entire area, and I will go into the Select menu here and go to Inverse. And then I'm just going to go under the Layer menu right here, and again, this is where you're going to find all the various layer settings or adjustments that you can do inside here. But in this case, I want to go under the New menu and we're going to do Layer via Copy, or you can use the keyboard shortcut Command J. And when I do that, notice what happens. It generates a new layer, giving it a layer 1, does it in a numerical order. And now, if I turn off the visibility, these icons next to the layers are these little eyeballs are basically how you turn on and off the individual layers. So if I turn off this background layer, you'll notice that now we have that box on its own layer against the transparency. And now I can move this object around on this layer. Now, the highlighted layer is your currently active layer, depending on what layer you're working on, so you can move that object around. If I were selected on this layer and I wanted to move that box, notice nothing happens. It's moving around the object that I can't see. So let's jump over to another image I've got open here. Now, here is an image I generated based on a number of different color fills and frames and shapes and things like that. Looks like a standard flat image, but look at my Layers panel here. You'll notice I've got a considerable number of layers going on in here, all the way from the background layer all the way up to the various parts that make up this image. And I can control each of these elements individually. If I highlight a certain layer and grab my move tool, you can see I can move that object around. So I'm able to build an image but still keep all my parts separate by putting them together in a layers panel. And the way the layers work is, try and imagine yourself at the top of this layer order looking straight down. And that's what you're seeing in the image right here. In fact, to get a better idea, I've taken this very same image and kind of tilted it in a way that you can see how those layers are going. So this very image right here is simply a buildup of all these combined layers. So we're just kind of tilting it and spreading them out just to give you a better idea. So each individual layer is a different item. I've got some shading layers here. Here's my background layer. There's a texture layer. Each of these frame layers, we've got the image, all these elements that make up the light, and then there's a lighting layer here. So all these individual elements combine to make this image that you're looking at right here. So, giving you an idea of how layers work, let's jump into the next lesson and talk about a couple of different aspects of layers as far as layer effects. You'll notice here in the layers panel, there's a number of things going on here. You got some layers that look like the basic layers we were talking about. There's some additional items in here. In fact, before we go to the next lesson, I do want to talk about one quick thing. You notice some layers have an additional icon here next to them. Now, this is known as a layer mask. Now, again, masking is another incredibly complex subject, but I just wanted to touch on this so you can see what's going on. What this is a way of hiding or revealing certain parts of your layer using a layer mask. And it does that based on 256 levels of gray. Now, anything that's white on this layer, as you can see, is going to be completely visible. And anything black is going to be hiding something. So to give you a better idea, let's go back over to this image here. So there's that box layer that I created. So let's say I wanted to hide a certain aspect of it. Well, I'm going to go down here to the bottom of my layers panel, and you've got a number of icons here, and I'm going to cover a couple of these in the next lesson, but I want to look at this one right here, the third icon. When I click on that, you notice what happens to my layer. It added that third icon there. And it's filled with white, as you can see, revealing everything on this layer. However, if I go over here and grab, let's set the foreground color of my brush to black. I'm going to grab that brush tool, and I'm just going here and I'm just going to start painting. And you'll notice that it appears to be erasing that aspect or that part of my box, when in reality it's actually not. It's actually painting right on that layer mask and temporarily hiding it. So if I hold down my Shift key and click right on that layer mask, you'll notice it gets a red X, which temporarily disables that layer mask, and you'll notice that the box is still there. I haven't erased anything. So it's a non-destructive way of hiding and getting various effects on your images, on your particular layers, without actually erasing them. So if I ever decided I want to go back to that, I don't want to have that box erased, you can simply grab that layer mask itself, drag it to the trash can, and then you just hit delete, and it's gone away. So let's jump back over there and look at these layers. You'll notice there's other aspects of these layers too. They've got an effects icon here, and that's basically something called layer styles, and that is something I want to talk about in the next lesson. So, hope this gives you a basic idea of how layers work. We're going to jump in a little bit deeper in the next lesson and talk about some things you can add to your layers. Oh, one final footnote before we leave this lesson. I want to talk real quick about renaming and throwing away layers inside your layers panel. You'll notice I have a number of these layers, and they're simply numerical, and that's just the default whenever you go and create a new layer. But if you wanted to name a layer for its specific content, you can simply just double-click right on the name itself and give it a new name. And we'll just call this, well, actually, let's go down here and let's select this frame layer, and we'll just double-click on that, and we'll call it Frame 1, and you simply press Enter, and it goes ahead and applies the name. Now, there are a couple of ways of deleting layers inside Photoshop. Now, new to Photoshop CS4, if I'm currently highlighted on a specific layer and you simply press the delete key, it will go ahead and delete that layer for you. Before, you weren't able to do that. In order to delete a layer and one way you can still do it is simply taking that layer and dragging it right down to the trash can icon at the bottom of the layers panel, and it will go ahead and throw that layer away as well. So, those are the quick things there. Let's jump into the next lesson and talk a little bit more about layers, shall we? Alright, as I mentioned, the next thing I want to talk about when it comes to layers is something called layer styles. And that's what these effects icons represent on these individual layers here. Now, layer styles are a collection of effects that are preset inside Photoshop that you can apply and modify depending on what type of objects you're going to be applying them to. So I'm just going to jump over here to this original box image that we had, and I'm just going to create a new layer, and you just do that by clicking the new icon, which is the second to the last one right here at the bottom of the layers panel. Let me just resize that. That'll create a new blank layer. You can also go into the flyout menu and choose New Layer. Also, under the layer menu itself, you can choose New Layer just right there. So on this new blank layer, I'm going to grab my rectangular marquee tool, and I'm just going to draw a box. And let's go ahead and get a color in here. I'm going to go into the Edit menu and go down here to Fill. And I'm just going to use 50% gray as my fill, and I'm just going to click OK. So now I've drawn a gray box onto this blank layer. Well, now I want to apply an effect to this. So I can do this several different ways. I can go into the flyout menu here, right at the bottom of the panel, and choose whichever effect it is I want to apply. In fact, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and apply a bevel and emboss. And when I do that, it opens up this menu, which allows me to modify that specific effect. I can even add additional effects to it. Of course, now bevel and embossing, these layer styles have been in Photoshop for quite a few versions, but there was a time when we didn't have layer styles at all. We actually had to do these various effects like drop shadows and beveling and embossing all from scratch. And layer styles have made it considerably easier for us to apply these effects and even modify them after we've applied them. So you can see I've applied a bevel and emboss. I can go here and change the style of the embossing. And these are all various different types of effects you can apply. And while I won't be able to cover every aspect of layer styles, I want you to go in there and really experiment with them because they have all kinds of possibilities with regard to them. You can go in here and increase the size, the depth of your beveling. You can even adjust the shading or lighting aspects of it. Just by moving this little icon around the circle here, it will determine your lighting direction on the object. You can see wherever I position the icon here corresponds with the lighting on the object itself. And you have your highlight and shadow mode, so you don't have to live with black and white colors. You can go in here and click directly on that little color swatch there and just change the color. If I just want to make that a red shadow there, we can certainly do that. We can add other layer styles as well. If I go in here and I want to add a drop shadow to this item, you simply highlight that property and it reveals the different parameters for that. So if I uncheck Use Global Light, which if you have the global light checked on, it means basically that all the lighting effects you apply throughout your layer styles, whether it's the bevel and embossing, the drop shadow, they're all going to correspond the same. So by unchecking that, you're actually able to modify the lighting on this specific effect individually. And there's just like the bevel and embossing, you move this line around the circle, it determines where the shadow is going to go. Now, in addition to that, you can modify these settings all with these sliders and everything like that, but you can also, as long as the layer style window is open, simply drag it off to the side and you can click and drag that object wherever you want. So in this case, I can modify that drop shadow by dragging it over here a little bit. Maybe I want to increase the size to soften it up a little bit. All that is done right inside there. Now, as I mentioned, these are live effects. So if I've made these changes and I go in here and click OK, you'll notice what happens inside the Layers panel. It has applied the effects icon, and now it reveals what I have done. I have effects applied to this. I have a drop shadow and a bevel and emboss. And they've also got the icons next to them, which means I can turn each one on and off without having to go back into that Layer Styles panel. In addition to that, I can go in here and modify them. If I double click right on that effects icon, it's going to open that window back up with all those same properties, and I can change them to no matter what I want. If I didn't want that red anymore and I wanted to go back to black, I can certainly do that without having to go and reapply the effect. Now, one other aspect of layer styles that I want to mention before we go out of here is in the blending options. Now, only thing I want to talk about here is these two sliders here. You've got the opacity and the fill opacity. The difference between these two is the opacity will modify the transparency of your entire layer. Everything, your original shape and the layer styles included. So if I drop this down to 0, you'll see everything disappears. So that's affecting the opacity of my entire object. However, the fill opacity, if I drop that down to 0, you'll notice that the layer style itself remains visible. We can still see the bevel, we can still see the drop shadow, but the original pixels on that layer are no longer visible. That's what it is. It'll allow you to apply certain effects over images while making that object transparent and leaving the effects themselves 100%. So that is in a nutshell layer styles. You'll notice that there are a number of different types of layer styles in here, but again, we don't have the time to go through every one of them. This one, I encourage you to go in here and just experiment with each one, get used to what types of things they do. I do have a course over on the Kelby training site that is a mini course all on layer styles and how to apply them and use them effectively in your design. So go over there and check that out, and I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it. Now, before we go, I just want to talk about one more aspect of layers, and that's the concept of blend modes. I'm going to jump back over to this image here, this layered image that we had, and you'll notice as I toggle through some of these layers and highlight them, right up in here there's a menu. And if I highlight different layers, you'll notice that many of these layers are set to different blend modes, basically. And what blend modes are is a way of your layers blending with the layers beneath it. You'll notice if I just go over here and grab my move tool, and we're highlighted on this layer here, if I just move this over a little bit, what this is a layer that contains a lighting effect on it. And if I go over here and take the blend mode back to normal, you'll notice that it's simply just a grayscale version of that frame. But I applied a lighting effect to it, and I wanted it to blend it with the original frame. So if I turn off the visibility of that layer, you'll notice that we can see the original layer. So when I turn the visibility of that back on, but I want it to blend with the original layer, not looking like gray like this. That's why I chose to go ahead and change it to the blend mode to overlay. You'll notice that it has enhanced the coloring on there. And this is what blend modes do. They affect the colors, and you'll notice they're broken down into categories. You've got these areas that affect the darkness, you've got these blend modes that affect the lightness of your image, and these values, or these settings, control the overall values of your image, rendering the 50% gray neutral in just in these areas here. Which is why if you see on the normal mode, we've got light and dark areas, but it's overall gray. By putting it in overlay mode, I'm only able to see those light and dark areas while rendering those gray areas completely neutral. So blend modes are an effective way of enhancing and even doing some corrections or adjustments to your images by using blend modes. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I hope you get a better understanding of layer styles. Like I said, there's a course on the Kelby training talking about layer styles in general or in more specific ways, and talking about blend modes as well. Okay, so in this final lesson on layers, I just want to talk about some of the different ways of working with layers that'll make your life easier, and those little gotchas that will sneak up on you every now and then when you're working with layers. So first off, here I've got an image that, like in the last lesson, I've got just some text with some layer styles applied to it, as you can see right here. And one thing I want to talk about is locking the transparency. Now, if I were to take my paintbrush, and you notice I've got the same green color set as my foreground color, if I just go in here and start painting on this layer, you'll notice that it's filling in pretty much anywhere I paint. And you'll notice also that the layer style is updating as well. Because the layer style is a live effect, it's also going to redraw as I add pixels to this layer. But let's say, for instance, I wanted to be able to paint on these letters and not go outside the lines in a sense. Well, not coloring outside the lines has never been easier. Here we have these lock settings here, and this very first one is called the lock transparency. So if I turn off my background layer, you notice that this text layer is on its own layer against a transparent background. If I go ahead and click on this and lock the transparency, if I take the brush tool as I did, and let's go ahead and change the color. I'm just going to click right on that foreground swatch, and it will bring up the color picker. And I'm going to talk about color selections a little bit later, but I'm just going to go in here, I'm going to grab this blue color here. And again, I'm going to go in here and paint on those letters. But notice I'm staying within the visible area of this layer. It's not going outside the transparency because we have the transparency locked. It's keeping that place intact. So I can paint freely on there, even outside the lines, and it's only going to affect my visible areas. So that's locking the transparency, and there's other features as well. This icon will lock the painting features, so it won't allow me to paint at all, but I can move the object around if I like. This next item does just the opposite. It doesn't allow me to move the object. You'll see a little warning pop up, but it will allow me to paint inside there, as you can see right there. And this very last item basically locks the entire layer. It won't allow me to move it or paint on it or do anything. So if you've got a number of layers open and you want to keep that layer visible but not necessarily modify it in any way, that's what you would want to do, is go ahead and lock the layer. Now I'm going to jump over to this first image we were dealing with and just show you a couple other things. Now, when you're managing multiple layers, you can certainly rearrange the layers any way you like. Let's say I wanted to take this frame layer and reposition it somewhere else in the layer order. You simply grab it and move it around your layer order, and the line between the layers will highlight as a little dark line there. And when you release, it will reposition the layer and you'll be able to move on. Now, if you wanted to move multiple layers, let's say I wanted to move both of these layers that contain the frame, you simply select one layer, hold down the Shift key, and then click directly on the other layer. Now they're both highlighted, and now you can just click and drag and move them both at the same time. Now, another aspect of layers is being able to generate selections from them. Now, let's say, for instance, that I wanted to generate a selection based on the shape of this frame on this layer. Well, all you need to do is simply hold down the Command or the Control key and then simply click directly on the layer preview. As you can see, my cursor changes. It adds a little selection icon there. When I click on it, it will load that layer as a selection. So if I wanted to isolate changes to this, I can simply load it as a selection, or in fact lock to transparency as I did before. And you don't have to be selected on a specific layer to load it as a selection. Let's say I'm highlighted on this frame layer here, but I want to load the image that's inside of it as a selection. Well, all I need to do is just do the same thing. Hold down the Command or Control key, click directly on it, and it will load it as a selection. And of course, up here at the top of the layers panel, you'll notice that we have those same opacity and fill dialogues that you saw in the layer styles earlier, where this one will affect the overall opacity of the layer, while this one will only affect what's on the layer, and if it has a layer style, it will completely remain visible. Now, one last aspect about layers or objects on your layers I want to talk about. I'm going to jump back over to this setting here. Let's say you've created an element on your layers, and let me unlock that. And say it's positioned up here, and you want to align it, maybe perhaps to the center of your document. Well, alignment is really easy inside Photoshop. I'm going to go under the Select menu. Let's say I want to center this text based on the overall image area. Well, I'm going to go under the Select menu and go down here and choose All. And you'll notice that it does, in fact, select the entire document, the marching ants around the outer edge. And you'll notice that in my options right here, if I have the Move tool selected, in the options right here, I've got a number of Align tools. And here's our vertical alignment rather. I'm just going to click that once, and you'll notice that it goes ahead and drops it in the middle vertically. If you move down the order here, we get this horizontal center here. So just clicking on those documents, and it does that based on the selection. So if I reposition this over here, and let's say instead of selecting the entire document, I just make a selection of a very small area. Well, when I do that same alignment, click here and then click there, it's going to do it based on that currently selected area. So just know that alignments inside Photoshop work based on the currently selected area, whether it's the entire document or a very small part of it. Okay, one final aspect about layers I want to talk about, I'm going to jump back over to this other layered image here, is merging layers together. So let's say I've got these two frame layers, and I like the way they look, and I know I'm not going to edit them anymore, and I've got a considerable number of layers in my document, and I want to minimize them considerably. You can simply go into the flyout menu and go down here and choose Merge Down, and you'll see that those two layers have now been combined into one. And you can do that with multiple layers. Notice that I have this one layer selected, and it's only going to merge one down. Well, if I shift-click on several layers and do that same thing, it will merge all of those layers together. So whether you have one layer selected or several, choosing that merge command will merge those layers together. Now, when you are done with your image and you have created a file that's got multiple layers, I can't stress enough that you're going to want to save your original layered file. When you are ready to print or output it for whatever reason is when you're going to want to do something called flattening your image. And I encourage you to always save your layered file. When you are ready to flatten your image, I would do this. Simply go into the Image menu and go down here to Duplicate. And then it will generate an exact duplicate of your image. And then you can go down into the flyout menu here and choose Flatten Image. And you'll notice that it basically crushes it all down into one convenient layer that's ready to be outputted and do whatever you need it to do. But as I mentioned, you always want to make sure that you're saving a layered version of your file. So that covers layers pretty much in general, or just in a very basic sense. As I mentioned earlier, Matt Kloskowski has a course on the Kelby training site covering layer essentials. He also has a book on layers, and as I mentioned, it is a complex subject, so there's an entire book on it, and I hope that these short lessons here, have given you a better understanding about how layers work and will help your work a little bit. But I do encourage you to dig deeper and learn more about layers, because there's so many more things going on in there. Now, there's one more aspect of layers we're going to get into a little bit later in this course, and that's something called adjustment layers. But we're going to continue on to the next lesson. Now, in this lesson, I want to quickly talk about the various ways you can select and modify colors inside Photoshop. Now, the first thing I want to point out here, and I pointed this out earlier in this course, is the foreground and background color swatches right down here at the bottom of the toolbars you can see. Now, by default, these are set to black and white, with black being the foreground and white being the background color. And you can make these the default in a couple of ways. You can actually click this small icon right above it, and it will make those colors default, or you can press the letter D on your keyboard. Will also bring up the default colors. To change the colors of either one of these swatches, you simply click directly on the swatch, and it will open up the color picker. And you can see right now we've got the color picker for the foreground color right here. And the way you search out and find colors is you've got this giant field that represents all the various shades of this particular color. You change the color by moving this slider up and down the color bar here. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to get a green color. Well, I'd move it over to where the green area is, and I can move my mouse around. And you'll notice up here in this little preview, we've got the current foreground color, which is black. And then we've got the new color, which is one we're selecting in here. So no matter where I drag this, it'll show me what that color is right inside here. And now there's a couple of icons right next to here that indicate a couple of things. This first one being with this little exclamation point here indicates that this is an out-of-gamut color, meaning that my printer may not be able to achieve this vibrancy of this color. So by clicking right on that, what it's going to do is jump to a color that will that my printer will be able to print. Now, the one beneath it is your web safe palette. So if I'm searching for colors that I know will look good on the web, you simply click that and it will jump to the color that will probably look the best on the web. So that's how you navigate through your color, all the various colors, and able to select the various shades of them. Now, this color picker is going to be universal throughout Photoshop, no matter what you're in, whether it be layer styles or any other adjustments or anything like that. When you're accessing the color picker, this is always how it will look. Now, some other aspects to this color picker is you can input specific RGB settings, CMYK settings as well, or LAB, or hue, saturation, and brightness values. But the settings that you're looking at right now are going to be the most commonly used. We leave this on the hue, and that allows us to access all of the various colors. You can see the various changes it makes if I select individual ones here. You've got your RGB settings as well, but by leaving it on hue, you can actually get the most accurate color. And if you need to input specific numbers or even specific web codes for colors, you can input those right inside here. Now, another aspect of the color picker is right here. You've got the color libraries. If I click on that, this is where you would access your various Pantone libraries. If you have very specific Pantone codes for stuff you're printing, here's where you would access that. And you can scroll through and find the various codes, or if you know a specific code, you can simply input it by inputting the number, and it will jump right to that. Then you would simply go back to, or click OK, and you can see that that color now is residing in your foreground swatch. Now, another way of modifying and selecting colors is here in the color panel, which if you go into the window menu and you notice it's open now, but if it wasn't, you'd simply go into the window menu and choose color. And I'm just going to drag this out so you can see what's going on here. You can see at the bottom here we've got that same color bar that was in the color picker, just a smaller version of it. And if I drag my mouse over it while I'm clicking and holding, it'll select those various areas of color. And you can modify them and tweak them a little bit simply by moving these sliders around, just like that. And you'll notice that it corresponds in the foreground color swatch here. So, adding those and mixing the colors, and you can change these sliders as well. If you wanted to perhaps work with CMYK sliders, you can certainly choose that. Grayscale sliders, it gives you a straight white to black gray bar there, and you can choose that various colors there. Now, another way of selecting colors is, one of my favorite ways actually, is using the swatches panel here, which is just a collection of various color swatches that you can choose from. Just by clicking directly on it, you can see that it does in fact load it into the foreground swatch. If you wanted to load it into the background color swatch, you would simply add the command key or the control key and click on that specific swatch, and there you have it. Now these swatches are built into Photoshop and they're the default set, but if you found that you wanted to save specific colors to the swatches panel, you can do that in a number of ways. Like for instance, if I have this color panel open, if I've mixed up a color, let's say I've got my RGB sliders and all this is looking good, I can take that and drag right over to my color swatches panel, and notice when I go outside of an area that doesn't have any color, it turns into a little bucket. And my currently set color, which is that green right there, if I go in here and click right in that area, it'll ask me if I want to name it. Let's just call it green 1. And I click OK, it adds that swatch to my swatches panel. So I can certainly add it that way. Another way is, of course, going down here to the new swatches panel. So let's say I want to make this yellow color. I'm just going to flip this around. If you click this little bent arrow, it'll actually flip the foreground and background color swatches around. And you saw if I just clicked in here and dragged, I could do that, but you can also click the new icon here and it will automatically bring that foreground color right into your swatches panel and it's all ready to go. The beauty is, if it's a specific color, when you are always working in Photoshop, it will always have these colors available. And if you've generated a set of colors, you can certainly go in here and go to Save Swatches and save these out as a color set that you can load into another machine, pass them off to another user, and other things like that. Now, another way of selecting colors is by using the eyedropper tool in sampling colors. Now over here I'm going to jump over and show you this image here, and let's say I've got a number of colors. I'm going to go ahead and set my workspace back to the default. So let's say I'm looking at an image and I like the color of something and I want to sample it and use it in something else. Well, go into the toolbar and you select the eyedropper tool as you see right here, and what this does is sample colors based on the sample size you got up here. Well, if you sample the point size, it's going to sample a very small aspect, basically 1 pixel of your image. Well, if you wanted to get a more evenly spaced variation of the color, I generally use the 5x5 average. So what it does is it takes the 5x5 pixel average of an area and samples the color based on that. So if I drag into my image here and click once, you'll notice that it has sampled that color into my foreground swatch. And again, if I want to save that into my swatches, we'll simply open up the swatches panel and just click right inside there, and we'll call that red book. And we've saved that color based on that image. Now that's sampling colors inside of an existing Photoshop image. What if you wanted to sample colors outside of Photoshop, maybe from your desktop or even from a web page perhaps? Well, I have a web page open here in my browser, and let's say on this Kelby training site that I like this green color background. Well, here's what I would need to do. I'm going to go over here and let's minimize my Photoshop window a little bit. I'm just going to resize it in a little bit here. And let's look at this web page. Position that on the side here. If I click on my image here and just not release the mouse, but just click and drag, you'll notice that it's continuously sampling no matter where I drag the mouse. You notice a foreground swatch. If you keep your mouse click and hold and drag outside the document, you'll notice that we go into the browser and it's sampling all those colors inside the browser. So we're sampling that green area, and when I release, now Photoshop has that color sampled, and we can now save that in our swatches panel as a color that we saved from outside of Photoshop. So that's the various ways to access and save colors inside of Photoshop. So I encourage you to practice and go in there and just play with the various color pickers and things and see what kind of mixtures you can come up with, and just get used to where all these settings are when it comes to selecting colors inside Photoshop. Now in this lesson we're going to talk about how to input and modify text inside Photoshop, and it's really quite simple. You just simply go right into the toolbar and go right down here toward the bottom, and you see the little T, and that represents our text tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and select that, and I'm going to go right inside my document, and if you notice over here in the layers panel, we've simply just got the background layer, but it's still going to let me go ahead and click and set some text in here. So once I do that, you notice what happened in the layers panel. It has gone ahead and created a brand new layer, but it looks a little differently than a regular layer. It's actually a text layer, meaning it's going to contain editable text, and we'll get into that, into the layers in just a moment. But you see my cursor here, so I'm going to go ahead and set some text. So let's go ahead and type, "This is text in Photoshop." Now you'll notice that it is a black, the fill color is set to black, and that's because of this foreground color swatch is at the default setting of black. And it's going to go ahead and take its cues from that and fill the text with that. But if you want to change that, it's simply a matter of at the end of this text, you can simply click and drag to highlight the text. And then right up here in the options bar, there are a number of text options, but you've got the color swatch right here. And if I click on that, it pulls up that color picker, as you remember from the other lesson. And I'm just going to take this circle and just drag it up to the white area and then click OK. And it's just click off to the side to deselect that text. And there you can see that our text is now white. Well, now if I want to reposition the text, I can simply just go here and grab the Move tool, and I can just reposition it anywhere I like. All the while it is remaining editable text. I'm just going to position it right up here. And if I want to re-highlight the text to make any further changes, you can do just as you did a minute ago, select the text tool and highlight it. Or one quick and easy way is to double-click right on that text layer icon, and it goes ahead and selects all that text for you. So let's look at the options up here that we have for this text. Well, the first icon here can quickly switch your text from a horizontal layout to a vertical layout, as you can see right there. So you can quickly toggle back and forth between that. The next item is your text style or your font that you select. So you can just click on that and scroll through the menu and select whatever type of text you want to set. And another quick and easy way, if you're not sure of what type of text, if you just double click into this window and highlight that name, you can use your up and down arrow keys to toggle through your entire list of fonts and get a preview of what your text might look like. So quick and easy way of being able to toggle through that text real quickly and give you a quick preview. The next item can set your italics or your bolds depending on what type of font you've selected. So if we go up here and grab this Adobe Garamond Pro, we can certainly choose the bold italic if we like, right inside that window. And the next item here is the size, and you can click in here and choose from the preset menu a specific size, or you can input a specific size yourself. Let's say I want to set it to 100 and press enter. Of course, you need to have the text highlighted and selected, and it will go ahead and resize the text there. Now, I'm going to bring that back to 25. Now, you also have the option of this scrubby sliders, as I mentioned in an earlier lesson. If I drag my mouse over that text icon, you can see that I've got the left and right arrows, and you can drag up and down to resize the text in real time there. Very, very useful feature there. Next item here is the sharpness or the anti-aliasing, and you can choose how your text is displayed. And the default is, of course, the sharp, and you can choose various other ones depending on what your preferences would be. And the other one is the text justification. You can have the center, left, or right. So simply clicking on these icons will set those accordingly. Here's the color icon, as you saw just a moment ago. Now, this item right here with the T and the little bent bar there means that you can actually apply some warping to this text. So if I click on that and apply it, you get this warp text menu, and if you choose from the various types of effects you can apply, you can change the orientation of the text. Now, the beauty of this, let's say I go ahead and do this flag one, and you take the slider and you can modify it or increase it or decrease the settings. When I click OK, even though we've changed the look of the text, it's still editable, as you notice. It's still highlighted, and I can change it. So we can put Corey's text effect. Notice it's maintaining that warping that we've applied to it. Let's go ahead and put that back in there. So it's maintaining that warping that we applied even as we are typing it. So let's go in here, and I'm going to go ahead and undo and set this to none. And we'll go ahead and OK out of that. So that's warping the text. Now, if you want to get in and be able to modify the text in a more specific way, as if you were in a page layout program, I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to actually go into my web browser and go to Lorem Ipsum and show you how you can work with a paragraph of text. So I'm just going to take my cursor and select this paragraph here, copy it to my clipboard. Let's go under Edit, go to Copy. Go ahead and minimize that. Now, to input the text into a text box inside Photoshop, you just simply grab the text tool, and instead of clicking in the document to set a text point, drag out a box. Just click and drag out as if you were drawing a selection. You notice the cursor is flashing in that corner there. I'm going to press Command or Control V, or simply go into the Edit menu and choose Paste, and you can see it's gone ahead and set that text. Now, I did select a tremendous amount of text, and it's obviously going outside the boundaries of my document, as indicated by this little cross right here at the bottom corner. I'm just going to double click, or actually triple click a couple times, and it will select the entire paragraph, and we'll go in here and make that text smaller by dragging a scrubby slider down. So now we've got that paragraph of text inside there. Well, if I want to be able to modify the text considerably more, you click this little icon right here, and this is going to bring up your character and paragraph properties to give you much more control over the text. Here you can modify the size, of course, change your font and the italics and everything like that. But you can also control the various other settings like your leading between the lines. If I want to increase or decrease the space between the lines, I can certainly do that with the scrubby slider, or input a specific number. You can set the spacing between letters, between multiple letters here, but if you select and just put the cursor in between two letters, you can modify the spacing in between those. Notice if I drag up, that space increases. Dragging down decreases the space. Now, there are various settings here. If I wanted to make this first letter much bigger, I can certainly go in here and make that vertical spacing, the vertical size, much, much larger. As you can see, that letter is getting much bigger. I can also increase its width as well, just by dragging this slider out. You can see that text is getting bigger. And you can also set the baseline shift. If I wanted to drop this down, you can see it's going beneath the baseline. By dragging it upward into a positive number, we'll take it above the baseline. So being able to modify that text is very important. And of course, here's the color swatch, which allows you to modify the color swatching, or the color of the text itself, by bringing up the color picker. Now, down here at the bottom, you can set your text. In fact, let's go in here and change this. Let's set this back to regular. If you had a font that didn't necessarily have an italic, you can set it to be a faux italic right here, just by clicking on that icon there. And that brings it back to normal there. You got various caps settings and other underlining and line through options here. And down here you've got your paragraph options, where you can set the justification, whether you want it to be center text, right justified, left justified, all these various types of settings. Simply clicking on them will modify the text accordingly. And you also have your indent features down here. You've got your left indent of the paragraph. Notice when I scrub over and the number increases, the indentation on the left side here is increasing. Same thing with over here. You can increase the indentation on the right side. This item here will set the indentation on the top line. Notice when I scrub through there, only that top line is being affected, giving me an indent for a paragraph or something like that. This item right here, if you increase the number here, it'll add a little bit of space before the paragraph. This item will add space beneath the paragraph. And you can also check on and check off your hyphenating features in here. So there's a tremendous amount of power over using text inside here. Before, in earlier versions of Photoshop, you would have had to go through a lot of hoops to make this text work. But over the years, they've implemented a lot of really nice text features to make text more manageable. Being able to work with text all in one application makes your work much, much easier. So there's the basic text features inside Photoshop. Now in the next lesson, we're going to talk about a very cool aspect of Photoshop, and that's using the brushes and the brush engine inside Photoshop. Okay, so in this lesson I want to talk about what is perhaps one of my most favorite features inside Photoshop, and that is the brushes, or more specifically the brush engine inside Photoshop. And we'll get to that in just a moment, but I first want to talk about how you go about selecting brushes and making simple modifications to them. So we're going to jump over here to the toolbar, and you see right here is the brush tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and select that, and you can see a number of options have shown up in the options bar here. Now the first one I want to point out is right here, this very first icon. If I click on that, it reveals my brush presets. And these are preset brushes that are built inside Photoshop. And if you don't see them when you click on this menu, you simply go into the flyout menu here, and you can go down here and choose from a number of categories of brushes. You just simply select it, click OK, and the list will show up. And to be able to use the brush, you simply just click on it. And the interesting thing about tool presets is that not only does it have a custom or a preset brush tip, but it also has a number of properties applied to it via the brush engine, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But if I go in here to my document and just start painting, you can see it's giving me a very interesting chalk effect. And the behavior of this is set up in that brush engine. Now, different from that is this menu right here, the second icon. If I click on that, you notice we've got access to a number of different types of brush tip shapes. And these are just the tip shapes. They don't have any properties applied to them or any behavioral properties applied to them using the brush engine. They're just brush tip shapes that you can actually modify yourself. So if you go in here to the flyout menu, you notice we've got a number of different categories that we didn't have in the preset area. These are just different categories of brush tips that you can select from. And again, the same way, you select the category, you can replace the list, or simply append it to your existing list. And you scroll down, and there's those brushes right there. When you select a brush, you simply click on it. You can go in here and modify the diameter and the hardness right here using these sliders. And the next items you have here, you've got the blend mode, which you can change the various blend modes. If you remember me talking about blend modes in the layers lesson earlier, then you could change the blend mode of your layers on how they blend with each other. You can also do the same here with your brushes and choose a specific blend mode and paint with that as you go. You can also modify the opacity of the brush, and you can also modify the flow and the airbrush setting. And this pretty much works just like an airbrush would. With it checked off, if I go into my document and just click once and hold, you'll see that it just gives me one spray of the pixels. However, if I go ahead and activate the airbrush and I go in here and click and hold again, you'll see it continuously is spraying pixels, very much similar to the way an airbrush would work. And the flow feature is very much similar to the way a flow nozzle works on an airbrush. You would simply just modify that on how much paint you want to be flowing. So you can drop it down a percentage, and it will make the paint flow a little bit less. So if you're used to working with an airbrush, this is a little bit closer to home in a digital fashion, but that's how those properties work. Now, let's talk about the brush engine itself. Now, you access it by going into this little icon right here and clicking on it, or you can go into the window menu and come down here and select brushes. And here's where you get a number of different types of properties that you can select from. Now, you can also access some of the various properties I've already showed you. These brush presets are the same presets you saw off in here. It just gives you the ability to select them all right in here in this one window. So you select a brush, and you notice that a number of these properties are checked on that make this brush behave the way it does. You can see down here in the preview window, it gives you a quick idea of exactly how that brush is going to behave. The brush tip shape is that same window, the second menu right here, and you can quickly access specific brushes here on how you want the brush to behave as well. So you see when I select these specific brushes, it's just giving me a straight up preview of how that brush is going to work. So if I were to paint, it just gives me a straight flow of that brush in there. So what if I wanted to change these properties? Well, you have a number of simple properties down here that you can change. You can change the diameter, you can flip the brush on its X or Y axis, you can modify the angle by inputting a specific number or using the scrubby slider. You can see if I change the angle, it reflects in the preview. And this is a very permanent change when you do this. So if you change the angle of your brush, it will always stay that way as you paint. And the roundness, of course, determines the flatness or the overall roundness of your brush. And you can also modify these interactively by going in here and clicking and dragging that arrow to change the angle. You can click these little control points and modify the roundness as well. Down here you can modify the spacing and hardness of your brush. So if we've got a very soft edge brush, as you can see right here, we can modify the hardness here and the spacing here as well. Now you can do these also interactively inside your document, and this is something brand new to Photoshop CS4. If I just move my brush panel out of the way and go inside my document, on the Mac, if you hold down the Control key and the Option key and drag your mouse left or right, you can see that we can interactively modify the size of our brush. Just like that. Now, if you're on a PC, you would hold down the Control key and then right-click and drag left or right to do the very same thing. Now, to modify the hardness or softness of your brush, you would hold down those same keys, the Control, Option, and then you would also add the Command key to that, and then drag left or right, and you can see it modifies the hardness and softness of my brush. Very, very cool. Now, another way of modifying the hardness and softness and the size of your brush on your keyboard is using your left and right bracket keys. So you notice if I use my left bracket key, my brush gets smaller as I keep pressing it. If I use the right bracket key, it gets considerably larger. And to adjust the hardness or softness of that, you simply add the Shift key to that very same action. So notice what happens in the preview window here. When I do this, if I hold down the Shift key and use the left bracket key, it gets softer. Right key gets a lot harder. So two ways to interactively modify your brushes right there inside the program, or right there inside your document window. Now, these other features you have, let's go ahead into the brush tip shape, and I'm going to select this leaf right here, because this will best demonstrate the very cool nature of these various brush features. Now, anytime you see the word jitter inside the brush engine, that basically means it's going to be a fluctuation of that brush as you paint. So if I have the size jitter set, that means the brush is going to change its size pretty much sporadically as you paint. That is determined on how the percentage is. Now you'll notice if I bring it down to 0, it doesn't really do that much. but by increasing the percentage, it's going to get the jitter the size even more, and of course 100% jitters it all together. Now anytime you see a control setting that you see right here, this is where you would set up your pen pressure. If you are in fact using a pressure sensitive tablet, or you can set up a fade or turn this feature off altogether. So if I turn it off, you'll notice the brush doesn't taper off on the ends, indicating that it's going to just work normally. However, if I go ahead and set it to pen pressure, you can see it tapers off, indicating that it's going to respond to how hard or how soft I press on the tablet. Other settings you can modify, the angle jitter, as you see. If I take this all the way up to 100, the brush just changes the angle, and it will do that sporadically as I brush around. Also the roundness jitter. Now, if you remember, I mentioned on the brush tip shapes, this angle and roundness here are very permanent changes if you modify them here. However, inside here, this is where it does it as you paint. It's a very cool effect. We'll also have the scattering feature, which allows you to basically just, as you see in the preview window, it tells you right away. It's scattering that brush and all over the place. You can modify the count of it. So let's do that. And if you see I just paint in here, it gives me a very interesting scattering effect. So, and I just want to say, these are a number of different features, and I could spend a great deal of time talking about these, but it's really a matter of experimentation. Just go in here and try different settings and see what kind of cool things you can come up with. You can also apply textures to your brush in your preset textures area right here. You can modify them by adding a texture to them. You can paint with dual brushes, meaning you select a brush tip shape here, and you can select one here and modify its properties. As you can see in the preview, various things are happening there. Makes the brush act a little bit differently. So it's basically overlapping two brushes at the same time. You can modify the color dynamics, meaning if, let's say if I had these leaves and I wanted to paint varying colors of fall leaves. So let's go here and select this color here and put that in the foreground. And let's put a darker brown or darker red into the background. And let's tell it to jitter the foreground and background colors. And as I paint, you can see it's basically toggling between those colors interactively as I paint, which is a very, very cool feature. So that's being able to modify the color dynamics. And you've got other dynamics here. You can jitter the opacity and the flow. Those settings that we saw up here in the options bar, you can modify those just by increasing or decreasing the percentages there. And you can also control it with your pen pressure as well. These other features down here don't have any settings to modify. These are just features that you can check on or off. You can add noise, wet edges to your brushes. Here's another place you can activate or deactivate the airbrush feature. You've got the smoothing feature right here, which if you don't necessarily have a very steady hand and you want to get very, very intricate strokes with your brushes, and if you're using a mouse perhaps, or if you're not very steady with the tablet pen, you can turn this on and it will assist you in helping you get much more smoother strokes in there. And you've got the protect texture feature. If you're using a texture, it will protect that as you paint over it, giving you that ability there. So again, I've only touched ever so briefly on these features. Again, I encourage you to experiment with them, try different brushes, try different colors and various, just go crazy with the settings and see what kind of cool things you come up with. And you'll remember them. As you start working in Photoshop, you'll start to remember how these features work and all these kind of cool features. And as I mentioned, I've been using it for years. I'm still discovering all kinds of cool stuff every time I go in here and play around with it. Okay, I wanted to talk about one more aspect about brushes, and that's something I mentioned earlier about creating your own preset brushes inside Photoshop and being able to use them whenever you want. So I'm going to jump over to this file I've got open here, and I want to define a brush out of one of these leaves here. Well, I'm going to go ahead and generate a selection of it, and I'm just going to choose this middle one right here, and I'm going to use my lasso selection tool and just draw a very loose selection around this area. Now, I don't need to worry about the white area right in here, because what's going to happen inside Photoshop is that when I go to define a brush, it's going to look at the darkest areas of my image and make those the most opaque parts of my brush. And it's going to leave the white areas completely transparent. So if I go under the Edit menu with that area selected and go down here to Define Brush Preset, you'll see that it's gone ahead and looked at that and defined that brush area. We'll click OK. So now that brush is inside my brush menu. So let's jump over to our file that we were working on earlier. And I'm going to go and select my brush tool. And inside the brush engine here, let's go into the brush tip shape and scroll down and see if we can find our leaf brush, which is right there. There it is. I'm going to go and select it. And again, we can go in here and you see the preview of the brush right inside my document. Let's go in here and modify some of these properties. I'm going to take that size jitter all the way up. And we'll make the angle jitter go crazy. We'll take the roundness jitter all the way up to 100. And we'll scatter it out like crazy. You can see it's giving me a very interesting effect already. Let's go ahead and make that brush size a little bit smaller. And let's give it a color. I'm going to go over here in the swatch panel and just grab this red color right here. And just to go ahead and start painting. And you can see it's giving me a very realistic kind of leaf look to it, which is very cool. So let's say I've made all these properties and these changes and set up the brush the way I want it, and I want to save it for future use. Well, if I go in here into the bottom of my brush engine and just click here into save this, it's just going to save the brush tip shape, not all the properties that I applied to it. So if you just wanted to save the leaf itself as a brush, that's where you would go ahead and do that. But if you want to save it as a tool preset with all the scattering and dynamics applied to it, go into that brush preset menu and choose in the flyout menu here, new tool preset. Then you can give it a name. You can also include the color that you're using as well. So if I wanted to keep this red color on that brush property, you can go ahead and leave that checked on. Click OK. There now the tool resides inside Photoshop. So anytime I go and make a new brush or do anything with any other brushes, I can always jump back in here and it will always have those same properties applied to it. So another way of not just using what's built inside Photoshop, which are a collection of really great brushes, but you can also go ahead and define your own brushes and apply the properties to them as well.